Before I tell you about the crazy outcome of the story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The heavy oak front door of my house rattled under the force of the pounding. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the desperate, frantic hammering of people who had just realized the ground beneath them had collapsed. I stood completely still in the middle of my living room, the hardwood floor cold beneath my bare feet. I held my phone in my right hand, the screen glowing brightly in the dim light of the hallway. The notification banner was still frozen at the top of the glass. It was a news alert from a major financial outlet, confirming the multimillion-dollar acquisition of my company. The ink on the contracts was barely dry, but the world already knew. And more importantly, my family knew. "Elijah, open the door. Please, we know you are in there." That was my mother, Eleanor. Her voice was shrill, cracking at the edges. I didn't move. I just looked up at the digital security panel mounted on the wall next to the thermostat. The high-definition camera feed showed the front porch in perfect clarity. There they were, my father, Robert, pacing back and forth, rubbing his face. My mother, pressing her hands flat against the frosted glass of the side panels. And standing right behind them, looking like a man who had just been handed a death sentence, was my older brother, Mason. His custom-tailored suit looked wrinkled. His shoulders were slumped. The arrogant smirk that usually lived on his face had been completely wiped away, replaced by a pale, sickening dread. They were screaming for me to open up. They wanted to talk. They wanted to make things right. They wanted to be a family again. But I just stood there, watching the silent video feed, feeling absolutely nothing for the people on the other side of that door. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel sadness. I just felt a cold, hard clarity. How did I go from being the ultimate family joke to the guy holding the keys to their entire future? How did a small piece of plastic and a circuit board turn the golden child of the family into a desperate man begging on my porch? It didn't happen overnight. It started exactly 2 years ago. It started with the smell of roasted chicken, a dining room table full of people who were supposed to love me, and a smirk I will never forget. I reached out and pressed the button to mute the microphone on the security camera. I wasn't going to let them in. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because some bridges don't just burn. Sometimes you have to pack them with dynamite and blow them to pieces yourself. I turned my back on the front door, walked into the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. To understand why I left my own flesh and blood standing out in the cold, you have to understand what happened in this exact same house, around this exact same kitchen island, when I thought I was finally going to make them proud. The dining room was suffocatingly warm. My mother always kept the heat too high when we had guests, and tonight was no exception. I had spent 3 hours cleaning the apartment, roasting a chicken with garlic and rosemary, and setting the table with the good plates. I wanted everything to be perfect. For nearly 2 years, I had been working in absolute secrecy on a project that I truly believed was going to change my life. It was a smart collar and home monitoring system designed to detect early signs of distress in pets, things like subtle temperature drops, heart rate anomalies, and hydration levels, long before a human owner would ever notice something was wrong. It wasn't flashy, but it worked, and it had the potential to save lives. My family sat around the table, their voices blending into a loud, chaotic noise. Mason, my older brother, was holding court as usual. He had just gotten a massive promotion at the corporate strategy firm where he worked, and he was making sure everyone knew about his new salary. He sat at the head of the table, swirling a glass of expensive red wine, looking incredibly pleased with himself. My dad, Robert, was nodding along to every word Mason said, his face glowing with pride. "So then the VP looks at me," Mason boasted, cutting a piece of chicken, "and says I'm the only guy who can handle the merger. It's a lot of pressure, but when you're at the top, that's just the air you breathe." My mother smiled and patted Mason's arm. Then she shifted the topic to Aunt Helen's recent funeral, diving deep into the nasty gossip about how our cousins were tearing each other apart over the inheritance. Julian, an old family friend who was practically an uncle to us, chimed in. He was currently going through a bitter divorce, and he spent 10 minutes complaining about his lawyer and the brutal custody battle over his kids. The energy in the room was toxic, focused entirely on money, status, and other people's misery. I took a deep breath, wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans. I stood up from my chair. "Hey, guys," I said, trying to project my voice over the chatter. "Before we get to dessert, I actually have something I want to show you." The conversation slowly died down, for pairs of eyes turned to me. I walked over to the kitchen counter, where my prototype sat hidden beneath a clean white cloth. I pulled the cloth away, revealing the sleek, black collar and the small base station. I explained the concept. I talked about the sensor technology, the early warning algorithms, and how it could prevent sudden pet emergencies. I spoke from the heart, explaining how I had drained the last of my old college fund just to buy the raw materials for the circuitry. Silence hung over the table when I finished. I looked at my dad, hoping for a nod of approval. He just looked confused. I looked at my mom. She was staring at her wine glass. Then, from the head of the table, came a sharp, sudden sound. It was a snort. I looked at Mason. He was leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. That familiar, condescending smirk was plastered across his face. He looked at the device, then looked at me. "That gadget of yours is a joke," Mason said, his voice dripping with absolute certainty. "Nobody's buying it. You're better off sticking with your regular job, little brother. Let the real engineers handle the tech world." I felt the blood rush to my face. I opened my mouth to defend the data, to explain the market research, but before I could get a single word out, Julian let out a loud chuckle. Then my dad started laughing, a booming, chest-deep laugh. My mom covered her mouth, giggling softly. Within seconds, the whole family burst into laughter. It wasn't polite, uncomfortable laughter. It was the carefree, booming laughter of people who genuinely found my ambitions hilarious. They looked at me like I was a little kid holding up a macaroni painting and calling it a masterpiece. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. I felt a vein pulse hot against my temple. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table. I just stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, feeling the humiliation burn into my skin like a branding iron. I looked at Mason, who raised his wine glass to me in a mock toast, his eyes sparkling with malice. Right then, in that room filled with the smell of garlic and the sound of my family's mockery, something inside me snapped shut. The boy who wanted their approval died, and the man who was going to take everything from them took his first breath. I didn't know it then, but their careless laughter was drafting the exact blueprint for their own downfall. The rest of the dinner was a blur. I went through the motions, clearing plates, serving coffee, and forcing a tight, dead smile whenever someone spoke to me. By the time they finally got up to leave, I felt completely hollowed out. I stood by the door, handing out coats. Mason clapped me hard on the shoulder as he walked past. "Keep dreaming, kid," he whispered, a smirk still dancing on his lips. After the front door clicked shut, the silence in the apartment was deafening. I walked back into the kitchen and began violently scraping leftover food into the trash can. The scrape of the fork against the ceramic plates was the only sound in the room. I loaded the dishwasher, my movements rigid and mechanical. I needed to take the trash out to the alley. I grabbed the heavy black bags and pushed open the back door. As I walked down the narrow side path alongside the building, I heard voices coming from the driveway. My family hadn't left yet. They were lingering near Julian's car. I stopped in the shadows, hidden by a large oak tree, and listened. "I just feel bad for him." My mother's voice drifted over the cool night air. "He tries so hard, but he's not realistic. I wish he would just settle down and find a normal job." "Mom, you indulge him too much," Mason replied. I could hear the sneer in his voice without even seeing his face. "If you don't tell him the truth, who will? That collar thing is garbage. Some kid in a garage isn't going to disrupt the pet industry. He's embarrassing himself." Julian laughed, a raspy, ugly sound. "The kid's a dreamer, Eleanor. Let him play with his little toys. Just don't let him ask you for a loan when he goes broke." I know, my mother sighed. I just won't mention it again. Maybe if we ignore it, he'll give it up and focus on something practical. I stood perfectly still in the darkness. My fingers dug into the plastic of the trash bags until my knuckles turned white. My chest felt tight, like a steel band was being ratcheted around my ribs. It wasn't just Mason. It was all of them. My mother, the woman who was supposed to be my safe harbor, had just completely written me off. She chose to protect the ego of her golden child rather than defend my dignity. I threw the trash bags into the dumpster. The heavy metal lid slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot. I walked back inside my apartment, locked the door, and leaned against it. I closed my eyes, letting the reality of what I had just heard wash over me. I wasn't going to be protected in this family. I was never going to be respected as long as I remained the underdog. If I wanted a seat at the table, I couldn't just ask for it. I had to build my own table, and I had to make sure they couldn't afford to sit at it. I walked over to the kitchen island, picked up the white cloth, and threw it in the trash. I looked down at the black plastic collar and the exposed wires of the base station. The device looked raw and unfinished, but the data logs didn't lie. I knew what I had. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Nicholas. Nicholas was a brilliant software engineer I knew from my university days. He was quiet, intensely logical, and he didn't care about social status or office politics. He only cared about things that worked. I hit the call button. It was 11:30 p.m. He picked up on the third ring. "Elijah, it's late. I need your help," I said, my voice low and steady. "I have the hardware built. The biosensors are tracking perfectly, but the server bridge keeps lagging, and I can't write the code fast enough to fix it before I run out of money. I need a partner." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Show me the data tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., at the diner." "I'll be there," I said. I hung up the phone. I didn't go to sleep that night. I stayed up until dawn, organizing every file, every schematic, and every test result. The era of playing the nice, quiet little brother was over. By the time the sun came up, my living room looked like a disaster zone. I had pushed the sofa against the wall and dragged 2 folding tables into the center of the room. The tables were covered in soldering irons, spools of copper wire, magnifying glasses, and empty coffee cups. Printouts of code and circuit diagrams were taped to the walls. It wasn't an apartment anymore. It was a war room. I met Nicholas at the diner exactly at 7. He sat across from me, sipping black coffee, his eyes darting across the pages of my test logs. He didn't say a word for 20 minutes. He just read. I sat there, my leg bouncing under the table, waiting for him to tell me I was crazy. Finally, he closed the folder and slid it back across the table. He looked at me, his face completely expressionless. "The hardware architecture is solid, but your server response time is a mess. If a dog's core temperature spikes, you can't have a 3-minute delay in the alert notification. 3 minutes is the difference between a vet trip and a dead animal." "I know," I said. "That's why I need you. Can you rebuild the bridge?" "It will take me 2 months of writing code every night," Nicholas said. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "And I'm not doing this for fun, Elijah. What's the manufacturing cost? Have you secured a reliable supply chain for the microsensors? What about cloud hosting fees when the user base scales?" He hit me with a barrage of questions. Questions about overhead, profit margins, server stability, and patent law. It was brutal, but it was exactly what I needed. For the first time, someone wasn't looking at my invention as a cute hobby. Nicholas was looking at it as a business. "I drained my college fund to buy the prototyping equipment," I told him, looking him dead in the eye. "I have exactly $4,000 left in my checking account. I can pay for the server space for 3 months. After that, we either have a working product to pitch to investors or I go bankrupt." Nicholas studied my face. He saw the desperation, but he also saw the resolve. "Okay," he said simply. "We split equity 60-40. I want control over the software architecture. You handle the hardware and the business pitch." "Deal," I said. reaching across the table to shake his hand. For the next 8 weeks, my life ceased to exist outside of that apartment. I went to my day job at a logistics company, stared blankly at spreadsheets for 8 hours, and then rushed home to solder motherboards until my eyes bled. Nicholas would show up at 6 in the evening, open his laptop, and type furiously until 2 in the morning. We ate cold pizza and stale bagels. We barely spoke to each other unless it was about voltage regulators or packet loss. Every time I felt my eyes drooping, every time my back cramped so hard I wanted to scream, I forced myself to remember the sound of my father's booming laugh. I pictured Mason's smirk. I played the audio of my mother's disappointed sigh in my head on a continuous loop. It was a dark, toxic fuel, but it burned incredibly hot, kept me awake. One night, Nicholas looked up from his screen, rubbing his tired eyes. "You're pushing too hard, man. You're going to burn out before we even get to the alpha test." "I don't have the luxury of burning out," I snapped, tightening a screw on a plastic casing so hard the screwdriver slipped and gashed my thumb. I didn't even flinch. I just wrapped a paper towel around it and kept working. If this fails, I have to go back to them and admit they were right. I'd rather die at this desk. Nicholas looked at my bleeding hand, then looked back at his screen. He didn't argue. He just typed faster. We were building something real, and the closer we got to a finished product, the heavier the pressure became. The stakes weren't just financial anymore. This was about survival. The deeper we got into the testing phase, the worse things seemed to get. It's a cruel truth about technology. The moment you fix one critical error, 3 new ones instantly spawn in its place. We hit a wall during the 7th week. The biosensors were accurately reading the heart rates of the test animals. We had recruited a dozen friends with dogs to let us attach the prototype collars, but the base stations kept dropping the Wi-Fi connection randomly. I was sitting on the floor at 3 in the morning, surrounded by disassembled plastic shells, a multimeter in one hand and a cold cup of coffee in the other. I felt physically ill. My head was pounding, and my vision was blurring at the edges. The money was almost gone. The server hosting bills were due in 5 days. My phone buzzed on the floor next to me. The screen lit up in the dark room. It was a text from Mason. "Hey bro, mom said you skipped Sunday dinner again. Still playing in your laboratory? Let me know if you need to borrow some cash for groceries. I just got my quarterly bonus." I stared at the glowing text. My teeth clamped together so tightly my jaw popped. It was the perfect passive-aggressive strike, wrapped in fake concern, but designed entirely to remind me of my poverty and his success. He didn't want to help me, he wanted me to grovel. He wanted me to admit defeat. Mason thought his texts were breaking me down. He didn't realize he was just handing me the matches to burn his kingdom down. I threw the phone across the room. It bounced harmlessly off the sofa. I grabbed the multimeter and slammed the metal prongs against the circuit board, testing the voltage on the Wi-Fi chip for the 100th time. It was stable. The hardware was fine. "It's not the board," I muttered to myself, my voice hoarse. "It's the firmware. It has to be." I dragged myself up from the floor and walked over to Nicholas, who was asleep in my desk chair, his head resting on his keyboard. I shook his shoulder roughly. "Wake up," I demanded. "We have a memory leak in the firmware. The Wi-Fi chip is flooding with garbage data and rebooting to clear the cache." Nicholas groaned, rubbing his face and squinting at the harsh light of the monitors. "Elijah, it's 3 a.m. My brain is mush." "I don't care," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Find the leak. Now." He saw the look in my eyes. It wasn't a request. Nicholas sighed, cracked his knuckles, and started diving back into the lines of code. I sat beside him, watching the terminal scroll. We sat in silence for 2 hours. The anxiety in my chest was a physical weight, crushing my lungs. If we couldn't stabilize the connection, the product was useless. Nobody buys a security monitor that goes offline when you need it most. "Got it?" Nicholas whispered suddenly, his fingers stopping on the keyboard. "Show me." I leaned in. He pointed to a single line of code buried deep in the network protocol sequence. A misplaced bracket. It was forcing the chip to store every ping command instead of executing and deleting them. The memory fills up in exactly 6 hours, and it crashes. He deleted the bracket, recompiled the code, and pushed the update to the base station sitting on the table. We waited. 6 hours passed as the sun came up, casting a gray, miserable light through the blinds. 7 hours. 8 hours. The green light on the base station stayed solid. The data stream on the monitor was a beautiful, continuous river of numbers. It wasn't crashing. It was holding. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 2 months. I looked at Nicholas. He was grinning, his eyes bloodshot and dark circles hanging heavy on his face. "We have a stable prototype," Nicholas said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "We have a company," I corrected him. I walked over to the sofa, picked up my phone, and looked at Mason's text again. I didn't reply. Let him think I was broken. Let him keep his arrogant little throne for a few more weeks. The storm was coming, and he was completely blind to the clouds gathering right above his head. 2 days after we stabilized the prototype, we hit another wall. But this one wasn't a technical glitch. It was sabotage. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing the user logs from our 12 beta testers. We had hired a guy named Samuel, a friend of a friend who ran a local dog walking business, to manage the physical distribution of the collars and collect daily feedback from the owners. I paid him a small stipend out of the very last of my savings. I trusted him because he seemed enthusiastic about the tech. I was scanning the back-end server when I noticed a bizarre anomaly. The data traffic spike wasn't coming from the collars sending information to the server. It was coming from the server being downloaded. Someone was pulling massive packets of data, our proprietary biosensor algorithms, the raw hardware schematics I had uploaded for Nicholas, and the user testing results. My blood ran cold. I immediately locked down the administrative access and began tracing the IP address of the download request. My fingers flew across the keyboard. "Nicholas, get over here," I barked. He jogged over from the kitchen, a half-eaten bagel in his hand. "What's wrong?" "Look at this outbound traffic." I pointed at the screen. Someone just cloned our entire development folder. All the schematics, all the code architecture. Nicholas dropped the bagel. "Are you kidding me? Did we get hacked?" "No," I said, my eyes tracking the command history. "This wasn't a brute force attack. Someone used an authorized credential. They logged in through the beta management portal." I pulled up the user ID associated with the download. It was Samuel's account. "Samuel?" Nicholas frowned, utterly bewildered. "Why would a dog walker steal our schematics?" "He wouldn't," I said, my voice hardening. "He doesn't know a resistor from a capacitor. He's pulling this for someone else." I felt a sickening twist in my gut. I opened the terminal and ran a trace route on the IP address that Samuel had forwarded the data to. It bounced through 2 proxy servers, but the final destination IP wasn't masked well enough. Nicholas, being the wizard he is, ran a script to identify the registry of the final IP block. When the name of the company popped up on the screen, the breath vanished from my lungs. It was Vanguard Strategic Solutions, the corporate firm where my brother Mason was a director of strategy. I stared at the glowing letters on the screen. The room felt suddenly very small, and the air turned freezing cold. It wasn't just a random theft. It was an assassination attempt from inside my own family. Mason hadn't just mocked me at that dinner table. He had recognized the value of the idea, decided I was too incompetent to pull it off, and decided to steal it out from under me. He probably paid Samuel a few $1,000s to act as a mole, knowing I was too broke to afford real security protocols. "Elijah," Nicholas said quietly, seeing the look of absolute murder on my face. "That's your brother's company." "I know," I said. My voice didn't even sound like my own. It sounded hollow, metallic. "We need to call the police," Nicholas urged. "We need to get a lawyer and file an injunction." "No," I said, standing up from the desk. I walked over to the window and looked down at the street. If I called a lawyer now, Mason would just deny it, wipe the servers, and tie me up in litigation for years until I went bankrupt. I couldn't fight him with lawyers. I had no money. I had to fight him with something else. I felt a dark, thrilling energy start to spread through my veins. The betrayal didn't break me. It liberated me. Any lingering guilt I had about cutting my family out of my life vanished instantly. Mason had crossed the line from being an arrogant bully to an active enemy. He wanted to play corporate espionage? Fine. But he was severely underestimating the guy he was playing against. "We aren't calling the police?" I turned back to Nicholas, a cold smile forming on my face. "We are going to let him steal it." Nicholas stared at me like I had lost my mind. "Are you insane? He has our core algorithms. He has the version we uploaded yesterday." I corrected him. "Sit down, Nicholas. We have some fake code to write." Nicholas didn't argue. He knew that tone of voice. He sat down at the keyboard, cracking his knuckles. "All right, boss. What's the play?" "Mason isn't an engineer," I began, pacing the room. "He's a suit, a strategy guy. He's going to take those schematics and algorithms and hand them over to Vanguard's internal R&D department to pitch as his own massive, disruptive idea. He wants to be the guy who brings in a multimillion-dollar new division." "So, we give him garbage?" Nicholas asked, a slow, wicked grin spreading across his face. "Not just garbage. Weaponized garbage," I said, leaning over the desk. "If we just break the code, his R&D guys will spot it immediately and realize the file is corrupted. We have to make it look brilliant, but fundamentally flawed in a way that only shows up during physical stress testing." We spent the next 12 hours crafting a masterpiece of sabotage. Nicholas altered the core temperature algorithm. He wrote a beautiful, highly complex string of code that looked mathematically flawless to a passing glance. But buried deep within the logic sequence was a fatal error. When the ambient temperature of the collar reached 85 degrees, the sensor would invert the data. It would tell the base station that the dog was freezing to death, triggering massive, cascading hardware failures and false alarms. I went into the hardware schematics and altered the voltage pathways. I swapped the resistance values on the power regulators. On paper, it looked like a highly efficient power-saving design. In reality, if anyone actually built a prototype using those specs, the battery would overheat and melt the plastic casing within 20 minutes of being turned on. "This is diabolical," Nicholas muttered as he compiled the fake files. "If a corporate R&D team builds this and presents it to a board of directors, the thing is going to literally catch fire." "Exactly," I said. My eyes locked on the screen. We unblocked Samuel's access portal. We placed the poison files into a folder labeled final_prototype_master and left it sitting right in the open. Then we waited. It didn't take long. At 11:45 p.m., the server logs lit up. Samuel's account logged in. We watched the progress bar in real time as the fake files were downloaded. The outbound IP traced straight back to Vanguard Strategic Solutions. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers behind my head. A wave of profound satisfaction washed over me. It was the first taste of real justice I had felt in years. Mason had taken the bait. He was going to walk into his company's boardroom, chest puffed out, claiming he had revolutionized the pet tech industry, and he was going to hand his bosses a ticking time bomb. "All right," I said, standing up and grabbing my jacket. "The trap is set. Now I need to go look him in the eye." "Where are you going?" Nicholas asked, looking up from the monitors. "I'm going to have coffee with my big brother," I replied. I texted Mason, asking if he had time for a quick coffee near his office the next morning. He replied almost instantly, "Sure thing, little bro, 9 a.m. Don't be late." I wasn't late. I arrived 10 minutes early at the upscale cafe across from the Vanguard Tower. I ordered a black coffee and sat at a corner table, watching the glass doors. At exactly 9 o'clock, Mason walked in. He was wearing a dark blue suit, his hair perfectly styled, radiating the kind of smug confidence that only comes from thinking you are the smartest guy in the room. He spotted me, plastered a fake, condescending smile on his face, and walked over. "Elijah, look at you. You look exhausted," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. He didn't order anything. He just rested his expensive watch on the table, making sure the light caught it. "How's the little pet project coming along in the garage?" He was probing. He wanted to know if I had noticed the data theft. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the arrogance, the greed, the total lack of respect for my humanity. "It's going well, actually," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "We're finalizing the core architecture today. Should be ready for a major pitch soon." Mason's smile widened just a fraction of an inch. "Glad to hear it. Just remember, the business world is brutal. Lots of sharks out there looking to steal a good idea. You have to be careful." I took a slow sip of my black coffee, keeping my eyes locked dead on Mason. He was so confident, so entirely convinced of his own superiority, that he actually thought he was playing me. He was sitting there, wearing a suit paid for by a massive salary, wearing a watch that cost more than my car, lecturing me about sharks while his servers were digesting the poison I had just fed him. "You know, you're absolutely right, Mason," I said, my voice smooth and calm. "There are a lot of sharks. In fact, my security logs showed some very interesting activity on our servers last night. It seems someone has been poking around, trying to pull our proprietary data." Mason's hand twitched. It was a microscopic movement, just a slight tightening of his fingers against the polished wood of the table, but I saw it. The fake smile on his face froze for half a second before he forced a look of brotherly concern. "Are you serious?" Mason asked, leaning forward slightly. "You got hacked? Elijah, I told you that you were out of your depth. You can't just run a tech startup from your living room without enterprise-level security. Did they get anything important?" "Oh, they got plenty," I said, leaning back and crossing my arms. "They downloaded the master files. But the funny thing about thieves, Mason, is that they usually aren't as smart as the people who actually built the tech. They take what they see on the surface, but they don't understand the foundation. Whoever stole my data is in for a very nasty surprise if they try to use it." I watched the color drain slightly from his face. The cocky gleam in his eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of genuine uncertainty. He shifted his weight in the chair, pulling his arm off the table. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice dropping a half octave, losing the patronizing tone. "It means," I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that didn't reach my eyes, "that stealing a blueprint doesn't mean you know how to build the house, especially if the architect intentionally drew the load-bearing walls in the wrong place." Mason stared at me. For a long, silent moment, the noise of the coffee shop around us faded away. The clinking of cups, the hiss of the espresso machine, the chatter of the morning commuters, all of it vanished. It was just the two of us, locked in a silent war. He was trying to figure out if I knew it was him, or if I was just bluffing, and I was letting him drown in the ambiguity. He cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive tie, pulling the collar of his shirt away from his neck. "Well, you should probably call a lawyer, Elijah. Get the authorities involved. You don't want to mess around with corporate espionage." "I don't need a lawyer, Mason," I said softly, standing up from the table. "I don't need the authorities. The problem is going to solve itself very, very soon." I didn't wait for his response. I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving him sitting alone at the table with his fake concern and his stolen, corrupted files. He left the cafe adjusting his expensive tie, completely unaware it was already tightening around his neck. When I got back to the apartment, Nicholas was pacing the floor, looking like a nervous wreck. "How did it go?" he demanded the second I walked through the door. "He took the bait, and he's terrified," I said, pulling off my jacket. "But we can't celebrate yet. We have a working prototype, but we need leverage before Vanguard realizes the files they stole are trash. We need a buyer." Nicholas stopped pacing and walked over to his desk. He picked up a piece of heavy, cream-colored cardstock. "Funny you should mention that. This arrived by courier while you were gone." I took the envelope from him. It had a wax seal on the back. Inside was a formal invitation, printed on thick paper. It was from Gabriel Hughes, the CEO of Apex Capital, one of the most aggressive and prestigious venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. Elijah Lawson and Nicholas Carter. You are formally invited to present the Sentinel Pet Monitoring System at a private technology showcase in Palo Alto. Friday, 10 a.m. I stared at the invitation. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was the door to the big leagues. If we impressed Gabriel Hughes, the game was over. Then my phone rang. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I let the phone ring 4 times before I swiped to answer. I kept my eyes locked on the invitation from Apex Capital, holding it in my hand like a shield. "Hello, Mom," I said. "Elijah, where have you been?" Eleanor's voice was tight, carrying that familiar tone of exasperated disappointment. "I've texted you 3 times this week. You haven't answered." "I've been working, Mom. I'm very busy right now," I replied, keeping my tone completely flat. "Well, you need to make time this weekend," she said, her voice dropping into a demanding register. "It's Julian's 50th birthday party on Friday. He rented out the country club. The whole family is going. Your father expects you to be there." Friday, the exact same day as the pitch to Gabriel Hughes in Palo Alto. A week ago, this conflict would have caused me immense anxiety. I would have twisted myself into knots trying to figure out how to please them without sacrificing my work. But standing in my living room, holding the golden ticket to my future, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hard boundary. "I can't make it, Mom," I said simply. "I have a business meeting on Friday. In California." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "A business meeting? For that dog collar thing? Elijah, be serious. Julian has been a friend to this family for 30 years. You are not missing his milestone birthday to go play Inventor on the West Coast. It's not a negotiation, Mom. I'm not going to the party. Let me speak to him." I heard my father's heavy voice grumbling in the background. The phone shuffled, and Robert came on the line. "Elijah, listen to me very carefully," my dad barked, his voice dripping with authority. "You are embarrassing this family. You live in a cramped apartment, you have no real career, and you skip family events to tinker with toys. Mason is bringing his new vice president to this party. You are going to put on a suit, show up, and behave like a supportive brother. Do you understand me?" I closed my eyes. I pictured them standing in their immaculate kitchen, completely convinced of their right to dictate my life. I pictured Julian, the man who laughed in my face, going through his bitter divorce, expecting me to worship at his altar. And I pictured Mason, a thief in a custom suit, waiting for me to bow my head and play my part as the family failure. "Dad," I said, my voice dropping so low and hard it surprised even me. "I don't care about Julian's birthday. I don't care about Mason's vice president. And I am done apologizing for my life." "Excuse me?" My father sounded genuinely shocked. Nobody spoke to Robert Lawson that way. "You listen to me, boy. No, you listen." I cut him off, the years of suppressed anger finally turning into a weapon. "I brought something I cared about to that dinner table 2 years ago, and you all laughed at me. You treated me like garbage. So don't pretend you care about having me around now. You just want me there so Mason looks good by comparison. It's over. Don't call me again until you learn how to respect me." I pulled the phone away from my ear and hit the red end call button. The apartment was dead silent. I stood there, my chest heaving, adrenaline flooding my system. I had just severed the cord. I had officially declared war on my own family. Nicholas was watching me from his chair, his eyes wide. He had heard the entire half of the conversation. He gave a low, impressed whistle. "Remind me never to get on your bad side, Elijah. Pack the prototype," I said, turning to him, my eyes burning with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. "We have a flight to catch. We are going to California, and we are going to sell this company." We spent the next 2 days running every possible diagnostic on the single working base station we had left. We packed the hardware into a reinforced, foam-lined Pelican case, treating it like it was a live nuclear warhead. Because, in a way, it was the bomb that was going to level Vanguard Strategic Solutions and Mason along with it. We landed in San Jose on Thursday afternoon, the air thick and warm, smelling of eucalyptus and jet fuel. We rented a cheap sedan and drove to a low-end motel near the Palo Alto event space. We didn't have the money for a luxury hotel. Every spare dime we had left went into the presentation materials and the plane tickets. The motel room smelled like stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach. There were 2 twin beds and a small, wobbly desk pushed against the wall. Nicholas immediately set up the Pelican case on the desk, popping the latches. "All right," Nicholas said, cracking his neck. "Let's run one final dry test to make sure the TSA didn't scramble the internal gyros when they x-rayed the bags." He plugged the base station into the wall outlet and connected his laptop to the diagnostic port. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, watching the green status light blink on the front of the black plastic casing. Blink, blink, blink. Then, the light turned a solid, angry red. Nicholas stopped typing. The screen of his laptop froze, a cascade of error messages flooding the terminal window. "No," he whispered, his hands hovering over the keyboard. "No, no, no. What is it?" I jumped up, rushing over to the desk. The dread hit my stomach like a bowling ball. "The firmware is caught in a boot loop," Nicholas said, his fingers flying across the keys in a desperate panic. "The power fluctuation in the motel outlet. It spiked the voltage regulator. The memory cache is corrupted." I stared at the red light. Felt like a physical blow to the chest. We were less than 14 hours away from standing in front of the most powerful venture capitalists in the world, and our only working prototype was dead on the desk. All the sacrifice, the drained bank accounts, the severed ties with my family, all of it was going to burn to ash in a cheap motel room. "Can you fix it?" I demanded, gripping the back of his chair. "I have to wipe the entire operating system and flash the memory," Nicholas said, sweat beading on his forehead. "But the core architecture is too heavy. If I try to reinstall the whole suite, the temperature tracking, the heart rate, the sleep cycles, it's going to take 20 hours to compile. We don't have 20 hours. The walls of the motel room felt like they were closing in. I felt a surge of absolute, paralyzing despair. The universe was playing a sick joke. Mason was going to win. He was going to steal my corrupted data, figure out how to fix it with Vanguard's massive resources, and I was going to be left with nothing. I closed my eyes. I took a deep, shuddering breath. Active protagonist. I couldn't let the panic win. I opened my eyes and looked at the error logs. "Don't reinstall the whole suite," I said, my voice shockingly calm. Nicholas looked at me. "If I don't, we only have half a product to show them." "I don't care," I replied, pointing at the screen. "Cut the sleep tracking. Cut the hydration metrics. Strip the operating system down to the bare bone. Just give me the core vitals, heart rate and temperature. Make it lean. Make it bulletproof. Can you do that by 8 a.m.? Nicholas stared at the screen, calculating the logic pathways in his head. He gritted his teeth. "It's going to be a brutal hack job. The interface will look raw." "Gabriel Hughes isn't investing in a pretty interface," I said, my voice hard as flint. "He's investing in the math. Do it." For the next 10 hours, that motel room became a pressure cooker. Nicholas didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He drank 3 cans of energy drink and stared at the screen until his eyes were bloodshot. I sat on the floor, manually checking the physical connections on the circuit board, replacing the blown voltage regulator with a spare from our toolkit. At 6:30 a.m., as the sun began to peek through the thin curtains, the red light flickered, turned yellow, and then settled into a solid, beautiful green. The system was alive. It was raw, it was stripped down, but it was functional. "We're in business," Nicholas rasped, slamming his laptop shut. The Apex Capital event space was a masterclass in modern corporate intimidation. It was a massive, open-concept floor with floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the rolling hills of Palo Alto. The floors were polished concrete. The furniture was minimalist and expensive, and the air hummed with the quiet, ruthless energy of extreme wealth. I walked through the double-glass doors wearing a sharp, charcoal gray suit I had bought at a discount outlet and tailored myself. Nicholas walked beside me, carrying the pelican case like it held the cure for mortality. We checked in at the sleek front desk and were directed to conference room B. As we walked down the glass-walled corridor, I glanced into the other rooms. I saw founders sweating through their shirts, pitching algorithms and apps to rows of stone-faced investors. We reached our assigned room and pushed the heavy door open. Sitting at the head of the long mahogany table was Gabriel Hughes. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair, sharp blue eyes, and the quiet, dangerous aura of a man who moved markets with a phone call. Sitting to his right was Sarah, a board member known for her focus on humane tech integration. But it wasn't Gabriel or Sarah that made my blood freeze in my veins. Sitting at the far end of the table, wearing a smug, predatory smile, was Mason, my brother. He was sitting in the room, wearing his Vanguard Strategic Solutions badge, leaning back in a leather chair. Next to him was Adrian, an infamous risk assessment consultant known for tearing startups to shreds. I stopped dead in my tracks. Nicholas bumped into my shoulder, following my gaze. I felt a surge of pure adrenaline flood my system, a hot, electric shock that cleared away the exhaustion of the sleepless night. Mason wasn't just here to watch. Vanguard was clearly one of the corporate partners invited by Apex to observe the pitches. Mason had maneuvered himself into this room specifically to watch me fail, to publicly humiliate me, and probably to ensure Gabriel Hughes passed on my tech so Vanguard could swoop in with the stolen and corrupted version later. Our eyes met across the long table. Mason gave me a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a predator acknowledging its prey. He was fully confident that I was about to walk up to the podium and make a fool of myself. He thought he held all the cards. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I stared right back into my brother's eyes, and I let a tiny, razor-sharp smile touch the corner of my mouth. I walked to the front of the room, set the pelican case on the podium, and popped the latches. The loud clack of the metal clasps echoed in the silent room. I pulled out the base station and set it on the table. "Gentlemen, Sarah." I began, my voice steady, projecting confidence I had forged in the fire of absolute desperation. "My name is Elijah Lawson, and I am here to show you how we are going to fundamentally redefine the pet health industry." Adrian, the risk consultant, immediately sighed and clicked his pen. "Mr. Lawson, we've seen 3 pet tech pitches this week. They're all glorified Fitbits for dogs. Please tell me you aren't going to waste our time." I looked at Adrian, then at Gabriel, and finally my eyes landed on Mason. "No, sir," I said, my voice carrying the lethal calm of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "I'm not going to waste your time. In fact, I'm going to expose a massive vulnerability in the current market. Because while other companies are focused on counting steps, and while some corporate strategy departments are busy trying to figure out how to steal flawed algorithms." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I saw Mason's jaw tighten almost invisibly. "We are focused on preventing fatal medical emergencies before they happen." I plugged the base station into the display monitor. The screen flared to life, showing the raw, stripped-down green interface Nicholas had built in the motel room. It wasn't pretty, but it was about to start a war. "Let me show you," I said, looking directly at my brother. "What happens when you underestimate the architect?" The room was completely silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning unit. I stood at the front of the massive mahogany table, the harsh fluorescent lights beating down on my shoulders. I had just plugged the raw, stripped-down base station into the main display monitor. The screen on the wall flared to life. It wasn't the beautiful, polished interface we had spent months designing. Adrian, the risk assessment consultant sitting next to my brother Mason, scoffed loudly. He tapped his expensive titanium pen against his legal pad. "Mr. Lawson, a college freshman can build a heart rate monitor. The pet market is saturated with activity trackers. Parents buy them, put them on the dog, look at the app for a week, and then forget about it. It's a novelty toy. Where is the retention? Where is the real value?" I looked Adrian dead in the eye. "The value is life and death. The data you see scrolling right now isn't just recording numbers. It is feeding into a proprietary predictive algorithm. It doesn't tell you that your dog ran 3 miles today. It tells you that your dog's core temperature has dropped by exactly 1.2 degrees over a 4-hour window while resting, which is the earliest indicator of internal bleeding or organ failure. We give owners a 24-hour head start before physical symptoms ever manifest. Sarah, the board member sitting to the right of Gabriel Hughes, leaned forward. Her eyes narrowed with sudden, sharp interest. You can predict a medical crisis before the animal shows distress? Yes, ma'am, I replied firmly. People love their pets like family. They will spend their entire salary to save them in an emergency room. But by the time they notice the dog is lethargic, it is often too late. We close that gap. We turn reactionary panic into preventative care. I was gaining momentum. I could feel the energy in the room shifting. Gabriel Hughes was watching me with an unreadable expression. His fingers steepled beneath his chin. I glanced down the table at Mason. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was staring at the screen, his brow furrowed, realizing that the pitch was actually working. I could almost see the gears turning in his head. He was probably congratulating himself on stealing this exact algorithm from my server 2 days ago. He probably thought his massive promotion was safely locked in. And then disaster struck. The scrolling green numbers on the massive display monitor suddenly stopped. The screen froze entirely. The silence in the room became thick and suffocating. I clicked the mouse. Nothing happened. I tapped the keyboard. A loud, harsh error beep echoed through the conference room. The base station on the podium began flashing a rapid, frantic yellow light. The memory cache, damaged from the motel power surge, was failing under the strain of the live presentation. I heard a chair scrape against the floor. I looked over and saw Nicholas gripping the edge of the table, his face completely drained of blood. He knew what that yellow light meant. We were crashing. Adrian let out a long, heavy sigh. He dropped his pen onto his notepad with a loud clatter. Well, so much for zero latency. From the far end of the table, Mason let out a low, familiar chuckle. It was the exact same sound he had made at the dinner table 2 years ago. The sound of careless, delighted humiliation. Looks like the little gadget still has some bugs, Mason said smoothly, his voice carrying clearly across the room. He looked at Gabriel Hughes with a sympathetic, patronizing smile. I apologize for my brother, Gabriel. He's always been a bit of a dreamer. This is what happens when you let amateur hobbyists into a corporate boardroom. The temperature in my veins dropped to absolute zero. Mason had just publicly claimed me as his brother, not out of pride, but to establish his own dominance. He was using my failure to make himself look like the rational, grounded executive in the room. He was putting me back in my place, right in front of the people who held my entire future in their hands. I didn't panic. I didn't flush red with embarrassment. I didn't try to make excuses about the motel room or the power surge. Every single insult, every late night, every moment of sheer desperation I had endured over the last 2 years instantly crystallized into pure, diamond-hard focus. I stepped away from the podium and walked directly up to the frozen display monitor. Technology fails, I said, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. I didn't look at Mason. I looked directly at Gabriel Hughes. Servers crash. Hardware degrades. If you build anything real in this world, you build it through public failure. But the true value of a system isn't found in its perfection. It is found in its recovery. While I was speaking, I reached behind the display monitor and manually unplugged the base station's primary data cable. I bypassed the frozen user interface entirely. I pulled a small, black USB diagnostic drive from my pocket, the emergency override Nicholas had coded at 4 a.m., and jammed it into the side port of the base station. I hit the manual reboot switch on the hardware. Anyone can sell you a product that works in a controlled laboratory, I continued, typing a brutal string of command codes blindly into the keyboard. But when you are dealing with medical monitoring, you need a system that knows how to save itself when the environment turns hostile. I hit the enter key. The yellow flashing light on the base station went dark for 3 agonizing seconds. The entire room held its breath. Even Adrian stopped leaning back in his chair. Then the light clicked to a solid, brilliant green. The massive display screen wiped completely to black. A second later, the green numbers returned. But this time, they weren't just scrolling. The screen split into 4 quadrants, showing the live data feed, the historical baseline, the predictive threat matrix, and the server stability log. It was running perfectly, faster than before. Recovery time, under 12 seconds, I said, stepping back from the screen and folding my arms. The system recognized the cache failure, bypassed the corrupted visual interface, and prioritized the transmission of the core biometric data. It didn't lose a single packet of information. Even while it was crashing, it kept monitoring. Sarah let out a soft gasp. She looked at the screen, then looked at me. It self-triaged the data, like a real medical professional. Exactly, I said. I looked down the table at Mason. His smirk had completely vanished. He was staring at the screen, his mouth slightly open, a look of profound confusion washing over his face. He didn't understand what he was looking at, because the brilliant, self-healing architecture he was currently witnessing was absolutely not the corrupted garbage code he had stolen from my server. Gabriel Hughes finally moved. He unclasped his hands, placed them flat on the mahogany table, and stood up. He was an imposing figure, and when he stood, the entire room went dead silent. He didn't look at the screen. He looked right at me. "Mr. Lawson," Gabriel said, his voice deep and resonant. "I have sat in this room for 20 years. I have seen thousands of pitches. I have seen founders cry. I have seen them lie. And I have seen them freeze under pressure. What you just did was the most impressive display of technical competence and absolute nerve I have seen in a decade." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Nicholas let out a shaky breath next to me. "Apex Capital is not going to offer you a seed round," Gabriel continued. "We are not going to offer you a licensing deal. I want the entire board, the patents, the algorithm, and the hardware. I want to buy your company outright, effective immediately. We will start the valuation at $25 million, with a retention contract for you and Mr. Carter to lead the newly formed division. $25 million. The number hit the room like a physical shockwave. Nicholas gripped my arm so hard his nails dug into my suit jacket. I kept my face perfectly still, but inside, my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. We had done it. We had actually done it. "We accept," I said evenly. Gabriel nodded. "Excellent. My legal team will draw up the paperwork by this afternoon." Then Gabriel turned his head. He looked slowly down the length of the long table until his eyes locked onto Mason. Gabriel's expression shifted from professional respect to something cold and terrifyingly sharp. The atmosphere in the room instantly plummeted. Adrian, the risk consultant, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Now," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Let's address the other matter at hand. Mason Lawson, Director of Strategy for Vanguard Strategic Solutions." Mason sat up perfectly straight. He adjusted his tie, trying to quickly paste his confident, corporate smile back onto his face. "Yes, Gabriel. And let me just say, Vanguard is incredibly excited to partner with Apex on this. Finding synergistic opportunities in the tech sector is exactly why my firm sent me here today." Gabriel stared at him. "Vanguard didn't send you here to partner with me, Mason. You are here because Apex Capital initiated a hostile takeover of Vanguard Strategic Solutions 3 weeks ago. We finalized the acquisition at 6 o'clock this morning. I own your firm." The color completely drained from Mason's face. He looked like he had been struck by lightning. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked around the room, frantically searching for a familiar face, but the other executives were staring at him with cold indifference. "And as the new owner of your firm," Gabriel continued, taking a thick manila folder from his assistant and tossing it onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. I spent the morning reviewing the new R&D initiatives your strategy department submitted to the board yesterday. Specifically, a highly anticipated project you personally championed. A pet monitoring algorithm you claimed would disrupt the market. Mason began to tremble. I could see his hands shaking where they rested on the table. The confident, arrogant golden child of my family was unraveling in real time. I had my chief engineers review the code you submitted, Gabriel said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. They found it fascinating, mostly because the ambient temperature logic was inverted. If we had built the hardware according to your specifications, the batteries would have melted the plastic casing and severely burned the animals wearing them. It was a catastrophic, amateurish failure. Gabriel leaned forward, placing both hands firmly on the table, looming over Mason from 20 feet away. "But that isn't why I am angry, Mason," Gabriel said softly. "I am angry because when my engineers ran a source trace on your code, they found watermarks embedded deep in the binary. Watermarks that belong to the young man standing at the front of this room. You didn't just submit a dangerous, flawed product to my board. You stole it from your own brother. And you were too incompetent to realize he had intentionally poisoned the files before you took them." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Everyone was staring at Mason. He looked like a cornered rat. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute horror and dawning realization. He finally understood the conversation we had in the coffee shop. He finally understood that I had played him from the very beginning. "Gabriel, please, let me explain," Mason stammered, his voice cracking horribly. "It was a misunderstanding. The data was shared internally. I can fix this." "You can't fix anything," Gabriel interrupted, his tone devoid of any mercy. "Corporate espionage is a felony. Submitting fraudulent IP to a board of directors is grounds for immediate termination. You are fired, Mason. Effective exactly right now. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal items, and then you will be removed from the building. If you ever set foot on an Apex or Vanguard property again, I will personally see to it that you are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Mason sat frozen. The reality of his complete destruction was crashing down on him. He had walked into this room expecting a promotion. He had walked in expecting to watch me fail. Instead, he was walking out unemployed, disgraced, and legally threatened by one of the most powerful men in the state. "Get out of my conference room," Gabriel ordered. Two large security guards in dark suits stepped through the back doors. They walked up behind Mason. He didn't fight them. He stood up slowly, his legs visibly shaking. He didn't look at Gabriel. He didn't look at the other executives. As he walked toward the door, he turned his head and looked at me. There was no smirk left. There was no arrogance. There was only the shattered, hollow look of a man who had finally met a consequence he couldn't manipulate his way out of. I looked right back at him. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just gave him the exact same slow, imperceptible nod he had given me when I first walked into the room. The door clicked shut behind him. The garbage had taken itself out. The aftermath of the pitch was a whirlwind of handshakes, legal jargon, and adrenaline. Nicholas and I were escorted to a private executive lounge where we sat down with Gabriel's top lawyers to review the preliminary term sheets. We drank sparkling water and talked about vesting schedules and equity retention. It all felt like a surreal dream. I was a multimillionaire. The struggle was over. 2 hours later, we finally left the boardroom to head back to our motel and pack our things. As we walked out of the glass front doors of the Apex building, the warm California sun hit my face. I took a deep breath of the fresh air. "Hey, Elijah!" I stopped, standing by the edge of the parking lot, leaning against the concrete wall of the parking garage, was Mason. He had been waiting for me. He didn't have his Vanguard security badge anymore. His tie was pulled loose, and his suit jacket was unbuttoned. He looked unhinged. He marched toward me, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Nicholas immediately stepped forward, ready to intervene, but I put a hand on his chest and held him back. I wasn't afraid of Mason. Not anymore. "You set me up," Mason hissed as he got within 3 feet of me. His face was red, and spit flew from his lips. You intentionally gave me bad code. You ruined my life. I lost my salary. I lost my equity. Do you have any idea what you just did to me? I didn't do anything to you, Mason, I said, my voice completely flat. You broke into my server. You stole my intellectual property. You tried to pass it off as your own to get a promotion. All I did was let you dig your own grave. I just handed you the shovel. You think you're so smart, Mason sneered, stepping closer, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. It was the same tactic he used when we were kids. You think you've won? You're still just the family disappointment. Wait until Mom and Dad hear about this. Wait until I tell them you sabotaged my career. They are going to disown you. I actually laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of genuine amusement. Disown me? Mason, I just sold my company for $25 million. I don't care what Mom and Dad think. Their opinions are completely worthless to me. And they are going to be worthless to you, too, when they realize their golden child is an unemployed thief. Mason raised his hand, his face twisting in sudden, violent rage. I didn't flinch. I just stared at him, daring him to do it. Before he could swing, a smooth, authoritative voice cut through the air. I would strongly advise against that, Mr. Lawson. We both turned. Walking out of the Apex building was David, the lead corporate attorney Gabriel Hughes had assigned to my account. David was wearing a 3-piece suit and carrying a slim leather briefcase. He walked over and stood directly between me and Mason. Who the hell are you? Mason snapped. I am the chief legal counsel for Apex Capital, David said calmly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded legal document. He handed it to Mason. This is a formal cease and desist order, accompanied by a non-disclosure agreement. It stipulates that you are forbidden from contacting Elijah Lawson, Nicholas Carter, or any employee of Apex Capital. It also forbids you from publicly discussing the events of today's meeting or the proprietary technology you attempted to steal. Mason stared at the paper like it was covered in venom. I'm not signing that. You don't have to, David smiled, a chilling predator smile. But if you violate the terms, Apex Capital will immediately file a civil suit against you for corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets, and tortious interference. We will drain whatever savings you have left, we will place a lien on your property, and we will ensure you spend the next 10 years buried in litigation. You will never work in the corporate sector again. Do you understand? Mason looked at David, then looked at me. The violent rage drained out of him, replaced by the crushing weight of absolute defeat. He was outmatched. He had brought a knife to a gunfight, and he had just realized the guns were all pointed at his head. He crumpled the paper in his fist, turned around, and walked away toward the parking garage. He didn't look back. His shoulders were slumped, his expensive shoes dragging on the pavement. He looked exactly like what he was, a pathetic loser. Thank you, David, I said. Just protecting our investment, Elijah, David replied smoothly. Have a safe flight home. The flight back home was a blur. Nicholas slept the entire way, snoring softly against the window. I stayed awake, staring at the clouds, letting the reality of my new life settle into my bones. While I was flying at 30,000 feet, the ground below was already shifting. I found out later exactly how the news broke. Mason hadn't just made an enemy out of me. He had a terrible habit of treating his subordinates like garbage. One of those subordinates was Chloe, his executive assistant at Vanguard. Chloe was the one who managed his calendar, organized his files, and suffered his daily temper tantrums. When Gabriel Hughes fired Mason, Vanguard HR immediately locked down Mason's office and seized his corporate laptop. Chloe was tasked with boxing up his personal items. While she was organizing his desk, she found a thumb drive. It was the drive Mason had used to transfer the stolen files from his personal computer to his Vanguard workstation. But Chloe found something else on that drive. A few weeks prior, Mason had proudly transferred a video from his phone to the drive to show a colleague. It was a video he had secretly recorded under the table during that fateful family dinner 2 years ago. The video showed me standing in the dining room, unveiling my prototype. It clearly captured Mason's voice mocking me, calling my invention a joke, and telling me to stick to my regular job. It captured the cruel laughter of my parents and Julian. Mason had kept the video like a trophy, a digital monument to his superiority. Chloe, who had been routinely belittled by Mason about her own salary and career prospects, watched the video. Then, she saw the Apex Capital internal memo announcing the acquisition of my technology, the exact same technology Mason had just been fired for stealing. Chloe didn't delete the video. She didn't keep it to herself. She anonymously forwarded the video clip, along with a brief summary of why Mason was actually fired, to every single executive, manager, and associate in the Vanguard corporate directory. By the time my plane landed, the video was viral within the industry. Mason wasn't just fired, he was professionally annihilated. The narrative was perfect, brutal poetry. The arrogant executive who mocked his struggling brother's invention was caught trying to steal it after it proved to be brilliant, and got himself fired by the very company buying the tech. It was the ultimate cautionary tale. His reputation was reduced to ash. No reputable firm would ever hire a man caught committing such blatant, humiliating corporate treason. He was a walking liability. And the fallout didn't stop at the corporate level. The industry gossip inevitably leaked out into the local community. Julian, the family friend who was still dragging his ex-wife through a bitter divorce, heard the rumors from a lawyer friend who worked in corporate law. Julian immediately called my father. My parents had spent their entire lives cultivating an image of perfection. They worshipped success. They paraded Mason around like a show pony, boasting about his promotions and his wealth. Now, the entire community knew that their golden child was a fraud, a thief, and a failure. And worse, they knew that the son they had publicly laughed at, the son they had treated like a joke, was now a multimillionaire who had single-handedly destroyed his brother's career. The social hierarchy of my family didn't just flip. It was completely obliterated. 3 weeks passed. 3 quiet, peaceful, incredibly busy weeks. Nicholas and I moved into a sleek new office space downtown. We hired a team of engineers. We finalized the patent transfers and watched the massive wire transfer from Apex Capital hit our newly formed corporate bank account. It was a staggering amount of money, enough to buy a private island, let alone pay rent. I didn't hear a single word from my family during those 3 weeks. The silence was golden. I knew they were dealing with the fallout of Mason's termination. I knew the shame was eating them alive. They were probably too paralyzed by embarrassment to even pick up the phone. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the embargo lifted. Apex Capital officially announced the acquisition to the public press. The financial news outlets picked up the story immediately. It was a great headline. A scrappy, underfunded startup revolutionizes pet health and gets bought out for $25 million by a Silicon Valley titan. My name was everywhere. My picture was on business blogs. The story of the garage inventor making it big was irresistible. At 8:15 a.m., my phone vibrated on my kitchen counter. It was a text from Aunt Helen's daughter, the cousin who had been fighting over the inheritance. Elijah, oh my God. I just saw the news. We are all so proud of you. Let's get lunch soon. It's been too long. I deleted the text. At 8:20 a.m., another text. This one from Julian. Kid, I always knew you had it in you. Forget what anyone else said. I always believed in your vision. Let me know if you need any advice managing that kind of capital. I deleted that text too. The hypocrisy was nauseating. These were the same people who sat at my dining room table and laughed until they couldn't breathe. Now they were crawling out of the woodwork, pretending they had been my biggest cheerleaders all along. They smelled the money, and suddenly, my past sins of being poor and ambitious were completely forgiven. By 9 a.m., my phone was ringing constantly. Unrecognized numbers, distant relatives, old high school friends. I turned the phone on silent and tossed it onto the sofa. I didn't care about their congratulations. I didn't care about their sudden, desperate affection. I poured myself a cup of coffee and walked over to the window. I lived in a nice house now. I had moved out of the cramped apartment and bought a modern, secluded property with a large front yard and a heavy oak door. It was quiet. It was safe. Then the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite chime. It was followed immediately by loud, frantic pounding on the heavy wood of the front door. I froze. I knew exactly who it was. The sharks had smelled the blood in the water, but the truly desperate ones don't use the phone. They show up at your house. Which brings us right back to where this story started. I stood in my living room, watching the high-definition security camera feed on the wall panel. My father, Robert, my mother, Eleanor, and Mason, standing on my porch, screaming my name, begging me to open the door. "Elijah, please, we need to talk to you," my mother cried out, pressing her face near the glass side panel. I watched them for a long time. I watched my father pace, looking stripped of all his usual authority. I watched Mason standing in the back, looking like a hollow shell of the man he used to be. His arrogance was gone. He just looked tired, defeated, and broken. I walked slowly over to the front door. I didn't unlock it. I just pressed the intercom button on the wall panel. "What do you want?" I asked. My voice piped through the external speaker on the porch, loud and clear. All three of them jumped. They crowded around the speaker. "Elijah, son," my father started, trying to inject his old, booming authority into his voice, but it faltered. "Open the door. We're family. We shouldn't be doing this through a speaker." "We aren't family, Robert," I said coldly. "We share genetics. That's it. Now, tell me why you are trespassing on my property, or I'm calling the police." My father flinched at the use of his first name. He looked down at his shoes. Mason stepped forward. He looked up at the camera lens. His eyes were red-rimmed. "Elijah, please. I'm ruined. I can't find a job. The industry blacklisted me. My bank accounts are frozen because of the legal fees Vanguard is threatening me with. I'm going to lose my house." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I need your help. You have $25 million. You could make a phone call. You could drop a fraction of that money and save me. I'm your brother." I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door. The absolute audacity of it. He tried to steal my life's work, he tried to ruin me, and now he wanted me to save him with the very money he tried to steal. "You aren't my brother, Mason," I said through the intercom. "You're a thief who got caught. You made a bet that I was weak and you lost. I'm not paying your gambling debts." "Elijah, stop it!" my mother screamed, tears streaming down her face. "He made a mistake. He was under a lot of pressure at work. You can't just abandon him. He's blood. He didn't make a mistake." "Mom," I fired back, my voice rising in volume. "He made a calculated decision to destroy me, and you let him." The silence on the porch was deafening. My mother stared at the camera, her chest heaving. "What are you talking about?" my father asked, looking genuinely confused. He looked at my mom. "Eleanor, what does he mean?" My mother covered her mouth with her trembling hands. She looked away from the camera, refusing to meet my father's eyes. "Tell him, Mom," I said through the speaker. "Tell Dad what you knew." She shook her head violently, sobbing. I didn't think he would actually do it." "Do what?" my father demanded, grabbing her arm. "Eleanor, what did he do?" "She knew," I said, my voice cutting through the air like a scythe. "She knew Mason was stealing my data. Julian heard Mason talking about it months ago. They all knew Vanguard was trying to rip off my prototype. She knew her golden boy was a thief, and she didn't say a single word to warn me." My father dropped my mother's arm. He took a step back, looking at her as if she were a stranger. "You knew? You let him steal from his own brother." "He had a future," my mother wailed, finally snapping. She looked up at the camera, her face twisted in desperate, ugly justification. "Mason had a real career. He was a director. You were just playing in an apartment. Elijah, I thought if Mason took the idea to a real company, it would actually become something. I was trying to protect the family's reputation. There it was, the ugliest, most naked truth of all. The sub-twist that finally severed the last microscopic thread of attachment I had to them. She didn't stay quiet out of ignorance. She stayed quiet because she fundamentally believed Mason was superior to me. She was willing to let me be robbed and destroyed as long as Mason succeeded. I felt a profound, chilling sense of peace wash over me. The anger evaporated. The hurt vanished. I was looking at three strangers. "Thank you, Eleanor," I said quietly. "That's exactly what I needed to hear." I looked at Mason through the camera. He was staring at the ground, utterly defeated. "Mason," I said, "look at the camera." He slowly raised his head. "I want you to repeat what you said at the dinner table," I commanded. "Word for word." He shook his head, fresh tears spilling over his cheeks. "Elijah, please don't do this." "Say it," I snapped, my voice ringing with absolute, unbreakable authority. "Say it, or I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing right now." He closed his eyes. His shoulders shook. He took a ragged breath and forced the words out of his mouth. The words that had fueled my sleepless nights. The words that had built my empire. I said, "That gadget of yours is a joke," Mason whispered brokenly. "I said nobody's buying it. I said you're better off sticking with your regular job, little brother." "And were you right?" I asked. "No," Mason choked out. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." "Yes, you were," I said. I reached out and flipped the switch on the intercom panel. A harsh electronic click echoed on the porch, cutting the connection. The microphone went dead. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't yell. I just turned my back on the front door, walked down the hallway, and left them standing on the porch. They could bang on the door all they wanted. They could cry, they could scream, they could tear themselves apart on my front lawn. I wasn't going to let them in. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. I walked into my quiet, sunlit kitchen. I poured the rest of my coffee into the sink and rinsed the mug. The house was completely silent. It wasn't a lonely silence. It was the peaceful, heavy silence of a fortress whose walls had finally been tested and proven to be impenetrable. I leaned against the kitchen island, tracing the grain of the marble with my fingers. I thought about the white cloth that used to cover my prototype in my old, cramped apartment. I thought about the boy who used to crave his family's approval, who wanted nothing more than to hear his father say he was proud of him. That boy was gone. The fire of betrayal had burned him away, and what was left behind was something much stronger. Some people think revenge is loud. They think it requires screaming matches, dramatic confrontations, and public humiliation. And sure, there was a little bit of that in the boardroom with Gabriel Hughes. But true revenge, the kind of revenge that actually heals you, isn't about destroying the other person. It's about rendering them completely irrelevant to your life. It's about recognizing that you don't have to shrink yourself to fit into a family that only values you when you are small. It's about building your own table, inviting the people who actually respect you to sit at it, and having the absolute courage to lock the door when the people who laughed at you come knocking. Mason, my father, my mother, they have to wake up every single day and live in the reality they created. They have to live with the knowledge that their arrogance cost them everything. I don't have to punish them anymore. Their own lives are punishment enough. I took my power back the moment I decided my dignity was more important than their comfort. And I will never, ever apologize for protecting the life I built. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. It wasn't an easy one to tell, and it wasn't an easy one to live through. But I wanted to share it because I know I'm not the only one. I know there are so many of you out there who have been mocked, underestimated, and overlooked by the very people who are supposed to support you. I hope this resonated with you in some way. I hope it reminds you that being underestimated is a weapon, not a weakness. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace and your own dreams? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to hear your stories. And finally, if you made it all the way to the end of this video, you belong to a very special group. I call it the 1% Club. If you are part of this club, I want you to go down to the comments right now and type the letter W for winner. That is our secret code. That tells me you are someone who doesn't give up, someone who stays until the end, and someone who understands what it takes to rise above the noise and take control of your own life. Please give this video a like to help the algorithm share this message with more people who might need to hear it today, and hit that follow button so we can keep sharing these journeys together. Stay strong, keep building, and never let anyone tell you your dreams are a joke. I'll see you in the next one.